Oh hello Dragonfly Swarm. I knew it. I knew this day was coming. Fischl is currently being rated up in the very first banner of 3.0 and I very much doubt it's a happy coincidence because the introduction of Dendro has turned her into much more of a beast than she already was. Fischl is a 4-star Electro sub DPS character who has garnered quite the reputation over time as an underrated and very versatile character, and during the lifespan of Inazuma's patches she began to see a lot more play than ever, which has now trickled into 3.0 wherein she's completely taking over some areas of the game's meta thanks to the introduction of Dendro. So in this video, I'm gonna discuss everything you need to know about Fischl in 3.0 so that you can maximize on her potential in this exciting new era of Genshin Impact, going over her kit details and the intricate interactions she has with Dendro, her constellations, her best artifacts and weapons, and then we're gonna talk about all the crazy new teams she fits into to top it all off. So let's get right into this guide by discussing Fischl's kit, or more specifically, her attack talent, which is actually kinda useless if you're not aiming to play her as a physical main DPS, that is, which it is a viable, albeit overshadowed playstyle, but it's not one that I'll be discussing in this video. Instead, let's shift the focus over to her elemental skill, which serves as the core of her entire playstyle. Casting her elemental skill will summon Oz to the battlefield for 10 seconds at C0, and the initial summon will deal AoE electro damage, and then for the 10 seconds he's on the field, he'll shoot at nearby enemies about 1 time every second. The ability is so powerful not only because Oz himself has a pretty high raw DPS potential, but also because every time he hits, he has a 50% chance to generate an electro particle, meaning you're averaging around 5 electro particles per Oz cast, allowing Fischl to battery quite well to her active characters and fellow electro teammates. It's worth noting too that Oz himself has a pretty rough ICD wherein he can only trigger a reaction such as aggravate once every 4 hits, but with the shared ICD on his joint attacks from C6, he begins to attack so frequently that this 4-hit ICD feels much less restrictive. Basically, Oz before C6 is okay at causing reactions by himself, but at C6 he becomes very good at causing reactions by himself. Fischl's elemental burst turns her into Oz for a short duration after casting, summoning down lightning on nearby enemies and keeping Oz on the field for his entire duration, as if you had summoned him through Fischl's skill. Now, the damage itself is not where the main value of this burst comes from. The main purpose of this burst is essentially to allow Fischl to keep Oz on the field for almost 100% of the time. Without her burst, he'd have a 15-second downtime because her skill alone can only keep him on the field for 10 out of the 25 seconds on the skill's cooldown. With the burst though, you can circumvent this by casting the burst after he expires from the skill, granting a much longer field time and therefore, obviously, much higher DPS. With her first Ascension passive, Fischl can essentially hit Oz with a charge attack to cause him to deal AoE electro damage, and while the damage isn't bad, having to wait for a full charge shot is a huge waste of time for Fischl and basically all of her teams. So this passive is quite negligible, except in some extremely situational situations. But her 4th Ascension passive is... there's a lot to talk about here, thanks to Dendro. Fischl's 4th Ascension passive is currently and has always been a very big part of her damage output and her value, and with 3.0 this statement has only become significantly more true. Essentially, the passive makes it so that anytime your active character triggers an electro-related reaction on an enemy, that enemy will be struck by Oz for a percentage of Fischl's attack. This instance of damage can happen roughly twice every second, and the craziest part is that despite how frequently this can be triggered, it does not have an ICD, meaning anytime you trigger this ability on an enemy affected by Quicken, for example, it will always cause aggravate, which allows Fischl to have a new and very significant source of damage inside of Dendro-related teams, one that I personally feel propels her into the realm of top-tier characters. Of course, this mechanic is also very relevant for teams like Taser teams, where high electro application benefits the team's swirls and shreds, but given that aggravate is a flat base damage increase reaction that benefits from Fischl's crit and her external damage percent bonuses, it is a huge source of consistent DPS for her inside of these new Dendro teams. With talent priority, luckily, unless you plan on playing main DPS Fischl, you can ignore her attack talent, instead investing into her skill, then a little bit into her burst. Technically, you don't need to invest in her burst since the majority of her damage comes from Oz and her A4, neither of which are tied to the scaling on her burst, but it is still decent extra damage if you do level it up. As for Fischl's constellations, I'm gonna kinda zoom through these since most players are familiar with the value of these ones, but yeah. C1 is irrelevant to most of Fischl's playstyles, but really nice for main DPS Fischl. C2 is a pretty good chunk of extra damage, and the AoE increase is quite enjoyable, especially for hitting multiple bloom seeds at once, or situations like that. C3 is very valuable since her skill is a major source of her damage, and that's kind of all there is to say about that. C4 is an interesting constellation that adds once again another damage source, this time on the initial cast of Fischl's burst. Not the most insanely game-changing constellation, but it is notable extra damage. C5 is technically her worst constellation since this only buffs the damage of the burst's cast, not Oz's damage, but damage is damage, so it's it's not that bad. And C6 is where things get quite snazzy. It's an amazing constellation because it grants Oz 2 extra seconds on the field whenever he's cast, and Oz now attacks simultaneously with your active character, granting Fischl increased off-field electro application and damage, which is really strong with how aggravate functions. But also, the extra 2 seconds on field per cast bumps her average particle generation to 6 electro particles instead of 5, and with Oz attacking simultaneously while shooting his periodic attacks, the 4-hit ICD he possesses becomes far less restrictive, allowing for a lot more aggravate procs and general electro application. It is by far Fischl's best constellation and a huge upgrade to her kit, but she still functions very well without it. Moving onwards to Fischl's best artifacts, we have some brand new artifact sets that she's gained access to, and some old ones that have become more relevant to her because of Dendro teams. So I'm going to discuss each of her most viable ones and which scenarios you should use them in. Starting with the brand new 4-piece Gilded Dreams set, which is essentially just a giant pile of stats for Fischl. This set is pretty competitive with all the other sets, although it does generally fall behind a little bit in some scenarios, but typically you'll be running either 2 electro units in one team or just 1 electro unit, that unit being Fischl. So this set will generally provide 180 elemental mastery and 14% attack for her, making it valuable as a boost to her reaction damage and ability damage, plus aggravate scales quite dramatically with EM, so it's a pretty safe jack of all trades artifact set that adapts to the team she's in, but EM and attack are not technically the most optimal stats for her to be stacking with aggravate. And to explain this, let's talk about the next set, 4-piece Thunder Soother. Thunder Soother grants a full-on 35% damage bonus against enemies affected by electro, and the flat damage amp from aggravate reactions actually scale off of the bonuses like these, making things like crit, electro damage, and general external damage bonuses very valuable on Fischl. To add to this, when you apply electro to an enemy affected by Quicken, that electro aura will actually coexist with the Dendro aura, which basically means that Thunder Soother's passive will have a very high uptime in these teams, making it even more valuable in Fischl now than it has been in the past. So in general, with aggravate teams, this will typically be her mathematical best in slot, and as long as you're maintaining the electro aura on enemies, it'll provide her a very high damage output. But it's also quite good in electro charge teams where hydro and electro auras also temporarily coexist on enemies. Another interesting set for Fischl though is the 4-piece Thundering Fury set, which before Dendro wasn't a set that many players at all used on Fischl because its main attraction came from the electro reaction damage increases and the skill cooldown shortening mechanic, neither of which things had that much value for Fischl herself. Now though, with the bonus aggravate damage and the emphasis on how much aggravate damage electro characters can do, it stands up a bit higher even despite Fischl's inability to make great use of the skill shortening mechanic. So you can expect this set to perform relatively competitively with my other recommended sets, and in the end it'll come down to differences in substats, but you can rest assured that it is a comfortable option for Fischl as of current. And then obviously you can fall back on a combination of 2-piece Thundering Fury, 2-piece attack set for general stat boosts and ease of access with better substats, and this combination performs generally just behind the aforementioned 4-piece options while being completely unconditional. So it can definitely be a good artifact combination to shoot for if you have the substats to back it up, and there's good value to be had because this set works similarly well across basically all of Fischl's sub-DPS teams. And in general with all of these artifact sets, except for Gilded Dreams, rest in peace, you can roll them at the crafting table now, so it's significantly less draining to farm for niche sets like Thunder Soother and Thundering Fury than it once was. But in regards to the artifact main stats, let's discuss which are going to be best for Fischl. As for the Sands, attack percent is usually superior to EM outside of Dendro teams, however, inside of Dendro teams, attack percent and elemental mastery Sands are both quite close, and in fact, it's a bit of a weird situation because I wouldn't say choosing between attack or EM is as simple as use the one with better substats, because it'll really depend on what other bonuses you're getting from your weapon and from teammates. So for example, if you're using Stringless on Fischl and Sucrose is in the team, you're getting a lot of external EM buffs, and therefore an attack Sands might give you an overall larger boost in DPS. But alternatively, with a weapon like Prototype Crescent and Kujo Sara on your team, you're getting lots of attack buffs, and thus will very likely benefit more from an EM Sands so that your aggravate damage can help to carry your damage output. In general with Dendro teams, whether you should use an attack or EM Sands depends entirely on your account, but both are generally quite competitive with one another. You'll want to go for a crit rate or crit damage circlet, keeping in mind that a 1-to-2 crit ratio will provide you the highest consistent DPS, and then for the goblet, oh, I don't know, cryo perhaps? That was a joke. Fischl always wants an electro goblet. With subsets, you don't typically need to focus energy recharge that heavily on her because with the help of electro resonance and or basically any external source of energy generation, such as Venti, Favonius weapons, etc., Fischl will end up circulating energy to herself quite well. So I'd say a safe range would be around 120 to 130% energy recharge on your Fischl. After energy recharge though, focus on Fischl's crit ratio, which is especially valuable in aggravate teams, but still generally the most valuable stat to prioritize in most of her builds. And then after the crit substats, Fischl enjoys EM and attack percent substats, and she wants to completely avoid HP and defense. Best of luck with that. Now then, Fischl's best weapons. Luckily, she has access to a lot of weapons. Unluckily though, a lot of her better ones are not exactly free-to-play friendly. In general, Fischl most prominently wants weapons that help to boost her personal damage, so you can't technically go wrong with any DPS focused weapon, and bonus points for weapons that provide crit value, because on her own, she has a difficult time building solid crit ratios. So we're gonna discuss her best weapons and then move down to her less optimal but still viable weapons, starting with her best in slot, Polar Star. Polar Star provides a very high crit rate stat as well as a passive that essentially boosts Oz's damage by a straight up 12%. Beyond that though, Fischl can quite easily stack up 3 of the 4 stacks on the second half of the passive, which reliably grants her 30% attack for Oz's entire duration at R1. This all works together to make Polar Star one giant stat stick for Fischl and Oz, and it comes in just ahead of her other very strong 5-star weapons, those of which being Aqua Simulacra and Hunter's Path, which come in close behind as her alternatively best weapons for similar reasons as they're both massive stat sticks. Aqua Simulacra provides a massive crit damage boost and a 20% damage bonus, which Fischl can benefit from while off the field, which makes it one of her best weapons as long as you're keeping the damage passive active as often as possible. And Hunter's Path is the newest 5-star bow to be released in Genshin, which provides a very high crit rate bonus, but outside of that, the only other part of the bow that Fischl will use is the 12% elemental damage bonus on the weapon passive, which is definitely nice, but it's not enough to make this weapon 100% competitive with Simulacra and Polar Star, so while it does sit comfortably as one of her best weapons, it's not her best. Similarly, Skyward Harp is another great option for its very high base attack and its respectable crit value, propelling this weapon to be around the same strength as Hunter's Path, and you'll find the most value in using this weapon on Fischl when she doesn't have to worry much about reaction damage, but it's still good for her even in reaction-focused teams. And finally, for her very top weapons, Thundering Pulse and R5 Alley Flash perform very similarly in strength, coming behind Skyward Harp. Sub-DPS Fischl doesn't really use the second half of Thundering Pulse's passive, but the high crit damage and base attack plus the extra attack bonus on the first half of the passive make it a respectable weapon on her nonetheless. And Alley Flash at R5 provides her a good amount of attack and a very high external damage bonus, which for aggravate especially is very valuable. I keep saying very. Propelling this weapon to similar heights as Thundering Pulse. Outside of those though, Fischl quite enjoys the Stringless Bow, and in Dendro teams, the EM substat is is super valuable for Fischl's damage output. But even in general, the bow's ability damage passives make it a reliable and consistent weapon to run on Fischl in just about any scenario. Similarly, Viridescent Hunt and Amos Bow can be quite solid on Fischl, though Amos Bow does have better wielders, so it comes at a bit of an opportunity cost, and V-Hunt is locked behind the Battle Pass, and even then is still outperformed by a number of her other weapons. Not at all to say that it's bad on her, just outperformed. Outside of those, your last options will be Moan's Moon, Fading Twilight if you have it, and Elegy for the End, which despite not technically being a DPS bow, still performs pretty well on Fischl if it's your only option. In terms of her free-to-play accessible weapons, Prototype Crescent can be decent on her, and can actually be really good if you hit weak points at R5, but that requires her to play very clunky, so it isn't really optimal. The brand new King's Squire Bow and the End of the Line Bow, both of which being Sumeru free-to-play weapons, are both kinda bad though. Fischl doesn't really care for either of them, and I believe Prototype Crescent outperforms them, so in regards to Fischl, there's really no point crafting or spending time fishing for these two bows. Finally, if you're severely out of options, you can use the Slingshot Bow for its good crit rate, but outside of that, sub-DPS Fischl won't have much to work with using this bow. And finally, the most anticipated moment of the day, what exciting and crazy new teams does Fischl fit in that makes her so strong because of Dendro? Let's talk about Fischl's team comping options, starting with the new stuff. Fischl is basically the premier Electro unit for aggravate teams and a staple Electro unit for most other Dendro-related teams. An aggravate team refers to a team whose job is to have an Electro DPS trigger as many aggravate reactions as possible, which you can do by having Dendro and Electro cause the quicken reaction on an enemy and then hitting that quickened enemy with an Electro attack. This will cause a flat damage bonus to be added to the Electro attack's base damage, which can then be multiplied by the character's crit damage and external damage bonuses, making it a very strong reaction for characters like Fischl who can spam the reaction very quickly. Inside of aggravate teams, the core synergy basically just requires a Dendro character and an Electro character, so the last two slots can be any number of characters, but for aggravate exclusive teams, I prefer running 2 Electro units with Dendro Traveler and an Animo unit, because since Animo can't react at all with Dendro, you can constantly swirl Electro for Electro resistance shred whilst also applying aggravate through the Animo unit's chain swirl reactions, which is really swag because a lot of Animo units like to have elemental mastery anyways. In doing this though, it's kind of important to have decent Dendro applications so that enemies are constantly being quickened, so the best Dendro character to pair with Fischl in these teams is currently Dendro Traveler. But Kole can work too, especially with Constellations. It's just that Dendro Traveler is objectively the most reliable Dendro support that we have right now. Aggravate teams will allow Fischl to constantly proc aggravate with her A4 passive, so she'll be outputting extremely high single target damage while the Animo unit works with the rest of the team to apply other sources of aggravate and constantly quicken enemies. It's very smooth and very fun, and actually quite versatile because with the help of an Animo unit, it becomes pretty viable in non-single target scenarios, even despite Fischl's own single target restrictions. And even if you don't use an Animo unit, double Dendro, double Electro still works well with some combinations of teammates using Fischl as the team's core. But moving on, there are also Hyper Bloom teams for Fischl, which personally and for no particular reason I don't love to play, but they are a lot stronger than I had assumed they would be. In Hyper Bloom teams, your goal is to use a Dendro unit and a Hydro unit to create bloom seeds on the ground, to which you then use Fischl to apply Electro to those seeds, which will cause them to Hyper Bloom, turning into homing single target Dendro missiles that seek out enemies. Because this is technically a triple element reaction, you will have to have Fischl, a Dendro unit, and a Hydro unit, and in the last slot, you do not want a Pyro unit. Pyro units will interfere with the reaction process of Hyper Bloom teams, so your last character should either be another Dendro, Hydro, or Electro unit, or an Animo unit. I wouldn't necessarily say Fischl is the most irreplaceable character for this team style, because there are other Electro units like Kuki that provide a lot more utility as the trigger for Hyper Bloom seeds, and she's a healer. But Fischl makes up for this lack of utility diversity with her very high aggravate damage as well as her ability to trigger the Hyper Blooms pretty easily. It's also worth noting that because of the way elemental auras interact with Dendro, this team will cause quicken reactions, to which Fischl can follow up with aggravate. So while it is quite heavily focused on single target damage thanks to the single target nature of Hyper Bloomed seeds, it is a lot of damage, and it's pretty fun to run with as well. Finally, for Dendro teams, and most specifically catered for Tignati, since he's the only Dendro DPS currently, you can use Fischl quite reliably as the Electro enabler of spread teams. She'll constantly apply Electro with Oz, which will help Tignati spread his Dendro damage on enemies, and Fischl can simultaneously proc aggravate for her own damage output, which again, with her A4 passive, makes for extremely high single target damage. As for non-Dendro teams, not much has changed obviously, so I won't actually go into detail regarding those teams, but in general, Fischl is a great and quite versatile unit for any of those teams that need a battery character or high Electro damage and application. So I'm gonna link a few videos down below that have some more Fischl teams if you're unfamiliar with her non-Dendro teams, and they're videos that are made by super cool people, so you can trust them. Anyways, that's about it for the 3.0 Fischl guide. A lot has changed, and I think it's safe to say that most players using Fischl will be slotting her inside of Dendro teams for quite a while, considering how much stronger she becomes with Dendro reactions, but overall, she's a great character with quite a number of build opportunities, which makes her valuable and versatile in pretty much every bit of the game's content. I think she's a top tier character, but I am not a theory crafter, nor am I a tier list maker, so... If this video helped you in any way or you just enjoyed it, please leave a like and consider subscribing, as it would very much help my channel out, and also follow me on Twitch, because I like to go live sometimes and I would love to see you around. Anyways, I'm gonna go explore more of Sumeru. It is hands down the prettiest region in the game. Hands down.